They thought they had you trapped. That's why they got comfortable. That's why they stopped trying. That's why they stopped listening. That's why they stopped respecting your boundaries. That's why they stopped valuing your presence. Because in their mind, you weren't going anywhere. And as far as they were concerned, they already knew how your story ended. You see, they believed that no matter how they treated you, you'd stay. Think about that. Not because they loved you, because they believed you had no other choice. They believed your loyalty had become permanent. They believed your love had become predictable. They believed your forgiveness had become automatic. They believed your kindness guaranteed your presence. And maybe you've experienced that. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a marriage. Maybe it was someone who thought that because you shared children together, they had permanent control over your life. Maybe it was someone who believed your financial situation meant you couldn't leave. Maybe it was years invested. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the fact that they had slowly convinced you that nobody else would understand you the way that they did. Whatever it was, they became very confident. And it's not because they had power over you, because they believed you had lost power over yourself. That's different. And honestly, that's one of the hardest things to realize. Not that someone wanted control, but that they became so confident in your willingness to keep abandoning yourself that they stopped treating your love like something they needed to protect. They started treating it like something they owned. And that's a painful realization. Because when you're a loving person, you don't immediately assume someone is trying to control you. You think that they're stressed, or you think they're overwhelmed. You think they're hurting. You explain it, you excuse it, you empathize with it. Meanwhile, they're becoming more comfortable speaking to you disrespectfully, more comfortable crossing your boundaries, more comfortable disappointing you, more comfortable believing you'll always come back. Because every time you stayed, their confidence grew. As far as they were concerned, they already knew how this story ended. And maybe, if we're being honest, there were seasons where they were right. Maybe there was a version of you that stayed longer than you should have. Maybe there was a version of you that kept giving one more chance. Maybe there was a version of you that believed if you just loved harder, communicated better, understood more, they would finally become the person you kept hoping they were. So when they crossed another boundary, they weren't taking a risk. They were following a pattern. The pattern had always worked before. But here's what they never expected. What if you weren't trapped? What if you only believed you were? Think about that. What if the relationship wasn't the trap? What if the trap was believing that your happiness depended on someone who kept proving they weren't interested in protecting it? That's a completely different conversation, because people can absolutely make your circumstances more difficult. Leaving can be painful. Starting over can be scary. Healing takes time. None of that should be minimized. But difficult isn't the same as impossible. And that's where everything began to change. See, they didn't need to lock any doors. They only needed you to believe that there weren't any. They didn't need to convince you to stay every day. They only needed you to believe that leaving wasn't an option. That's the real trap. Not always the circumstance, the belief. Because beliefs shapes decisions, and decisions shape lives. Eventually, you stopped asking, how do I get them to love me the way I love them? And you started asking, why am I working so hard to earn something that should never have required me to abandon myself in the first place? That's the question that changes everything. Because now, you're no longer trying to save the relationship at the cost of yourself. You're trying to save yourself. And once that shift happens, everything else starts shifting too. One of the things I always say is this: the moment you realize you still have a choice is the moment your freedom begins. Whether you understand that psychologically, philosophically, spiritually, or simply through your own life experience, this principle remains the same. Freedom doesn't always begin the day that you leave. Sometimes freedom begins the day you stop believing that you're stuck. And honestly, before we go any further, I want to share something with you real quick. A large percentage of people who watch these videos aren't actually even subscribed. We're talking around 75 to 77% of the viewers that come through listen, resonate, but haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Only about 23% are subscribed. So if my messages speak to you, if you've been getting value from these conversations, take a second to subscribe, please. It really helps more than you realize, and it allows me to keep creating content for you just like this. Now, that's one of the biggest reasons I do what I do. I help people reinterpret their past so that they can reclaim their future. Because maybe what happened didn't mean you were powerless. Maybe it meant you had forgotten how powerful you really were. Maybe what happened didn't mean you were trapped. Maybe it meant someone benefited from you believing that you were. And those are two very different stories. And the story that you believe becomes the life that you create. And that's exactly why I wrote Phoenix from Stability to Power. Because there comes a point where every person has to stop asking, how do I keep them? And start asking, how do I stop losing myself? That's what Phoenix is about. Learning to trust yourself again. Learning to set boundaries without apologizing for them. Learning that confidence isn't becoming someone new. It's returning to the person you were before you started believing you had to shrink to be loved. They thought they had you trapped. They thought that you would stay. They thought you'd keep settling. They thought you'd keep doubting yourself. They thought you'd keep choosing them over yourself. They never expected you to realize the only thing they truly needed was for you to believe you had no choice. And the moment you remembered that you did, the trap disappeared. You see, the real victory wasn't proving them wrong. The real victory was becoming someone who no longer needs anyone else's permission to choose themselves. Peace, blessings, love, and power.